Well, welcome to the fifth and final webinar in this series where we have marked the International Year for the Elimination of Child Labour. This is brought to you through Be Slavery Free and Embode. And we want to say, I think from all of us, we've had a fabulous time putting this together. We have learnt so much from each other. We've learnt so much from the participants. And it is always just so refreshing to be able to go on a learning journey with other people. So welcome to this fifth and final. As my name is Carolyn Kitto and I'm the National Co-Director of Be Slavery Free. And when Fuzz and Artie start their things, then they will also introduce themselves. To begin with tonight, I want to acknowledge that we are on Aboriginal lands, and I am in the west of Sydney, and so the traditional owners of this land are the Jurag people. Jurag people. Sorry, the last webinar I did was in Gadigal land. This is in Jurag land, and we want to pay our respects to elders past, present and future. We want to thank the original inhabitants of this country for their care and custodianship of the land. And we also acknowledge that in many cases, the invasion of white people has meant that they have been kept in slavery-like conditions. So the title of tonight is Why Aren't We There Yet? And we thought that was an appropriate kind of way to begin tonight's conversation, to say, well, we've been talking about being there, so why aren't we there yet? And one of the things that I want to contribute to that discussion is that so often people say to us when we're doing this work, well, you know, all this time and energy is going into this, why isn't the problem fixed? Sociologists call the kind of issue that we're addressing today a wicked problem. Now that title doesn't attribute moral characteristics to the problem, even though in this case we would probably say there are some moral characteristics to the problem which are wicked. But what it recognises is that these problems are extremely difficult to solve. And they're difficult to solve because usually there's either incomplete or contradictory knowledge or contested evidence. When you start to work in the modern slavery area, one of the things you'll find is that different people will give you different numbers. It's because we don't really know. It's an illegal crime in around the world, so nobody feels informed telling us what's happening. The second reason is that there are a large number of people with very differing opinions and huge numbers of stakeholders that are involved in this that all see the problem from a different perspective. The third reason is that there are usually large economic implications in wicked problems. In other words, there's a fear that if we change something or we modify it, that it will have massive effects both on individuals, nations, and perhaps the world economy. And this problem is interconnected with a number of other problems. So it's interconnected with the problem of poverty, it's interconnected with the problem of racism sometimes, sexism, and so on and so on. So there's a lot of other big problems that are connected with this problem. And I guess we're not afraid of wicked problems, and we don't believe that they are unsolvable. But to solve these kinds of problems requires cross-sector collaboration. It requires looking at it from a whole lot of different angles. It requires what Edward de Bono calls parallel intelligence. And something that Artie and Fuzz and I know very well, it requires perseverance. It requires being willing to take steps without being 100% certain of success. And that's the world that we are navigating when we're talking about child labour and the issues that are involved in it. It's a wicked problem. we think wicked problems are the kinds of problems that are really worth solving in this world. So we want to start by doing a bit of a reflection on what we've learnt so far in the International Year of the Elimination of Child Labour from the various panelists and people we have interacted with. So Artie, why don't you kick off, give a little introduction of yourself, just in case there's anyone on that doesn't know you, and what stood out for you in this journey of the workshops and webinars that we've done?
So yes, I'm Artie Kapoor, or Arti Kapoor, depending on who I'm talking to. So I am the executive director of Embode, and I've had it's been an absolute privilege co-facilitating these webinars and presentations over the course of this year with Faz and Caroline and the Be Slavery Free team. It's really been a team effort. So yeah, we've had some really, really insightful webinars this year, haven't we? I mean, the last one was with young people, which was really, really one of the most enjoyable panels that I've ever facilitated. And I think it stood out for me also because of what I learned. And you know, one of the things that stood out was how young people, what young people want to know, how it affects them when their classmates are in child labor, how much effort it takes for the young people themselves to come out of child labor. And also, there were quite a few questions for me around what kind of work could be done also by children in a legitimate, safe way, and how. And I think those are some gray areas which I think we often veer away from. But one of the other things I was really reflecting on this year while we were doing our webinars is this complexity means that we're all seeing it from different angles. And but actually we hardly ever actually listen to the communities and children that are involved in this and that are impacted by this. And so we made this small step of inviting the young people, you know, to the panel and starting to listen to them. But I think we've got a long way to go in terms of listening to people, not just children, but also families. But the other thing I wanted to say was that I also really enjoyed hearing from the other panelists over the course of the year. We had some wonderful NGOs speaking directly from their experience in the field, and also kind of talking about the complexity of why child labor is happening. And we got to see that child labor doesn't always happen because somebody wants it to happen. It's not like it's happening and we always need to blame somebody. It happens because of causes, conditions, enablers, cultural patterns, and socioeconomic conditions. So I'm looking forward to unpacking a bit of that today. So yeah.
Great. Okay, thanks, Artie. Faz, over to you. Introduce yourself and what did you learn? It's got to be different to Artie, even though you probably agree with that.
We so often agree with Artie, and that's been the delight in actually doing this series together. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are viewing this. And we do have people on from companies, from as campaigners, some government departments, and we know that as this is recorded, many people will also be viewing this in their own time and in their part of the world where it is incredibly difficult to do it live. So welcome to all of you on that. I'm the other co-director of Be Slavery Free, and with Caroline, who's my colleague, co-director, best friend, and the person I'm married to. We help to run Be Slavery Free, which we've been doing now for about 11, 12 years. So it's been a fascinating series. And when we came up with it, and we were talking this through with Artie on one of those wonderful times that we get together. We prefer to get together in person in Bangkok, and we are dreaming of the time we can go to a beach together, walk along it, and actually just dig in further and further into a lot of these things that we've been talking about in the series. But I think one of the outstanding things, or a number of the outstanding things that we've learned, was one when, in the first one, when Artie gave the overall understanding of what child labor is, how do we understand it, what are the dynamics, what's some of the things which are happening which have affect and effect. It was absolutely stunning. It was so stunning. In fact, we've had over 1,000 downloads of that webinar alone, because Artie is brilliant and explains it so well. And I think that what it gave was this framework of understanding some of the ways that we can both talk about it, but also understanding why it happens, how it happens, and that we don't want to jump to solutions straight away, but rather we've got to sit and listen and to understand the situations that are there. So many times child labor happens in contexts which are quite foreign to us or outside of our realities. So to be able to get, probably one of the most important things, I think, is empathy. We've got to listen, and we've got to enter into the shoes and see things behind the eyeballs of the people who are both caught in child labor, and the families that are associated with this, with people who are trafficking, and with people who are trying to work in the legal area, and those who are trying to work in the community development and international development. So we need to see things from multi-stakeholders and from multi-contexts to get any grasp. But then when we had the session with ICI and with Kevin Boson from Lint Spriegel, Kevin's insight, I thought, was so important, because he is, he was involved in child labor when he was younger. His family are cocoa growers. He is a cocoa grower. He also has his own farm and plot. And he has been involved with a number of different sectors in the cocoa industry in particular. But it was so good to have someone who was able to say, this is what it looks like. And the conversations we've had with Kevin, where we've asked, what would you do in a village? What would you do in a local community if there was child labor? And listen to him lay out those understandings of what's involved with child labor, but also to understand if something is wrong, you don't bring in the police straight away. You go to them and you tell them, we think this is wrong. If that doesn't work, you go to the village chief or a respected person, and you tell them. They go and talk with them and try and mediate and to change the situation. And if that doesn't work, then you've got to go to the authorities to try and do something about it. So I thought that progression was really, really important. And then with MV in India, to look at a holistic one about looking at a child-free zone where everybody in the community, government officials and businesses and social workers and community leaders and families all work together to say, this is not acceptable. Children should be in school, in education, and how do we facilitate that? And some of the really creative ideas that they had, like when people were caught in child labor, what do you do when they're behind in school and they're boot camp, to actually bring them up to speed to get them back into that, to segue back into school was just so good. And I think then as we looked at the at ICI, what they were doing, the National Cocoa Initiative, and they've been trying to work on a systemic level in looking at child labor monitoring and remediation schemes, and saying this is it's not the silver bullet. It's not the final answer. It's the next step in what we have to do. And then I think last time with Artie, I was so excited about that. I mean, I'm a youth worker, I'm a youth work consultant, and I love working with young people because I believe in the future. And then continually throughout my life have tried to build the next generation and the next set of leaders and the next ways of changing the culture and steps forward. So I think all of those things have really come together with all the other experience that we have had working around the world with people in child labour in the communities, the industries and the companies which are connected with it.
Great. Now, we're really keen in this session to get some Q&A from you. If you want to put anything in the Q&A, we'll be monitoring that and keen to get any questions that you might want to ask. So that's down the bottom of your screen towards the right-hand side. So Artie, why, so, you know, in 3 sentences or less, given it's a wicked problem, why aren't we there yet?
We're not there yet because I think, first of all, I think it's a long-term, the solution is going to take a number of steps. And given the kinds of investments we have been making in some sectors in some countries, I think we need to be a lot more astute about the way we do intervene and the way that we do respond. Fuzz, you just talked a little bit about, you know, what would you do in a community if somebody was to find child labor, and then what happens? I think that's the immediate, isn't it? What happens in the immediate term, what needs to happen in the medium term, and what needs to happen in the long term. The longer term you go, the more you need to kind of step back. And we can have top-down approaches and bottom-up approaches. And I think one of the things that we need to learn, and we need to learn fast, is that if we're looking at a top-down approach, it can't actually be about child labor. So if you're trying to find a top-down approach to eradicating child labor, it should actually not be about child labor. Does that make sense? I hope it makes sense. It is a wicked problem, so this is an answer to a wicked problem. This is about the enablers. Child labor is a symptom. Child labor is a result. Child labor happens because of X, Y, Z. And so if we want to eradicate child labor, we need to look at the X, Y, Z. And the higher up we go, the more we need to actually focus on those enablers, on those causes and conditions. So that could be, you know, making sure we have access to universal basic minimum education for all children. That's just basic. But before that, we need to make sure their families are okay and get them to have access to water, you know, clean water, electricity, and things like this. So what we've seen in a lot of countries that have made a lot of difference in child labor, if we look at good practices, effective strategies, we can look at a lot of countries in Asia, Thailand, Indonesia. These are countries that have gone a long way in reducing child labor in this part of the world. And some of the fundamental differences have been, you know, universal access to education, supporting families to get kids in schools, good quality education, because that's quite different. We've actually got you know, a crisis on our hands with the quality of education in many countries, where children are actually going to school and still being illiterate when they come out. And so what we need is basic good quality education. So I think that's why when after we've had all of these interventions into child labor, we're actually looking in the wrong place. It's almost like saying, why are you looking for the keys? You know, isn't there that story about the man who's looking for his keys outside? Yeah. Yes. What is that, Fuzz? I think you know the story better than me.
Yeah, it's a great one. I use it so often. It's a play. It's one of Sartre's famous plays, and it's set on a blackened stage with a man in a suit on his hands and knees looking around under a street light, which causes a ring of light on the stage floor. And so the gendarme, the policeman, comes along and thinks it looks suspicious, goes up and says, "What are you doing?" He says, "I lost my house keys." And he says, oh, well, I will help you look for them. So they have this conversation as they're walking around this circle of light under the street light. And after quite a long conversation, the police person says, look, are you sure you lost it here? Because we've looked all around this circle of light. And the person says, oh, no. I lost it over there, and points to the darkest part of the stage. And the policeman says, well, why are you looking for it here? He says, well, this is the only place where there's any light.
That's it, isn't it? And I think that, I mean, for me, that really sums things up, because, you know, if we are looking at going for a child-centered point of, from a child's point of view, you know, actually there's a lot of things that children need in order to have a childhood conducive for, you know, growing their potential and having a good upbringing and having a good childhood. And so child labor happens because a lot of things aren't in place. So that's just fundamental to what, like, one of the basic things I wanted to say. And I think that as long as we don't have those basic infrastructural issues sorted out across the world, we're not going to be able to solve the issue of child labor. And I think that we need to take a lot more of a realistic response to child labor than a kind of reactive approach to child labor.
Yeah.
So, Carolyn, why don't you think we're there yet?
Oh, okay. I wasn't expecting that.
I
would agree with Artie. I think, and I would also agree with what I said earlier, that it is a wicked problem. I think there are a number of drivers, and I really loved Dr. Shanti's from MV Foundation.
Yeah, that's it. Yes.
Who said instead of saying that child labour is caused by poverty, we actually need to flip it and say that poverty is
caused by child labour.
Poverty is caused by child labour as well.
Both ways.
So it kind of works both ways. And whilst ever we don't break this cycle, we are perpetuating both. We're perpetuating poverty. We're perpetuating child labour. And I find it interesting. We have a number of conversations with different agencies, and a recent conversation, somebody said, will people stop telling us that poverty is the cause of modern slavery and child labour? And because we know that. Well, if we know it, why don't we do something about it? And I think that's what's really important. I think we isolate the problem. We probably locate it as a problem in a family rather than a problem that is global, because if people weren't buying the products that are a result of child labour, that's you and me, there would be less demand for child labour. If the global value chains were actually paying people enough, and children wouldn't need to be forced out to work. So I think it's really important to also look at what our role is in it. And I think we distance these issues from ourselves, and therefore we don't see our complicity.
Can I add one other thing to that? And that is that I think child labour primarily, and Artie, you sort of were certainly leading towards this. Most times child labour is a systemic problem. It's because of the systems that are there. And systemic problems need systemic solutions. And so if it's poverty, we've got to look about income and income security. So often debt is a major part of children being forced into labour and out of school and out of safe situations. Sometimes there's intergenerational debt that's there. Other times it's that the people are just not being paid enough for farms. People are not having adequate sourcing of labor in safe ways for fishing boats. And in factories, a lot of time children are used because their fingers are smaller, so they can actually do the beads and the needlework on garments, or they can get the cotton seeds out of the cotton balls to do that. And so it's because the systems are not there with just and fair understandings of work and valuing people. So therefore, we've got a cultural thing that it's okay for children to do this. We've got a systemic thing of systems are in place which causes this to happen and perpetuates what's happening. And then a lot of times it's government policies and laws are not being enforced because there's not rule of law. And even policies in many companies, which are excellent policies, are not put into action with strategies and in ways where it's evaluated and checked to see what's happening there. So I think the systemic area is one of the biggest ones. And so long as we are continually just working with individuals, we'll never get to the whole system to understand the root causes. And we just work with the system, with the symptoms, rather than getting to the causes of what's happening.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go, Artie.
Well, one of the things that, came out this year was the UNICEF ILO report, which showed that, according to the latest study, that child labor had actually increased in number. And, it was quite saddening to read and to imagine, the number of children involved in hazardous work and why. And one of the things that was pointed out, and I have been, also reading, papers around how I guess we're going to get onto it next, hopefully, about what we need to do. But, in terms of this issue of poverty, you said, Carolyn, and Fuzz, you were also talking about like this kind of, you were both talking about global supply chains. So one of the things that we also need to be aware of, especially if we're sitting in the West, is the level of debt that a lot of these countries are still under as well. Because you talked about debt, that was it. You talked about debt at family level, but we also need to look at debt at national level. And the fact that a lot of, Joseph Lipinski here has just said, the COP26 highlighted how the global North has been in a life or death conflict with the global South and profits over people. I mean, I think there does need to be some recognition of the fact that we are, we're talking about child labor in a lot of countries where, in fact, that global South and global North divide has actually, countries have developed on the basis of the countries that are still, let's say, still developing, whether it's because of, colonialization in past decades and centuries, or whether it's still because they're still under huge amounts of debt. And, what is the responsibility of more developed countries around the world, especially Western governments, in actually releasing that debt and also increasing aid to actually support fundamental development of basic infrastructure and systems in countries around West Africa, even, as well as, some countries in Asia. And I think that's really important to recognize.
And it's how that debt is dealt with that's so important, Artie, isn't it? For instance, in West Africa, places like Cote d'Ivoire, they had massive debts, and the World Bank said, okay, we'll forgive it as long as you go on to the world system and the open market with your cocoa. And so for them to do that, the costs of them being able to compete within that were so high that they could not afford to use labor. And so they started using children in that process. So it's not just having debt dealt with, it's the way that debt is dealt with, which is so crucial. And again, it comes back to the economic systemic ways, which go from the top down that you were talking about and the bottom up, but also there's that middle part there. Adi, I
Right.
wonder if you might say again about, Karen, what do you think about looking at the three spheres? Because I think that has been really important.
Mm. There's three spheres of, remind me again, because there's a few three spheres.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The macro, meso, micro.
And the contextual,
systemic, and biographical.
Oh God, you're really testing me here now. You're going to have to help me remind me what we're talking about. So we're talking about, so sorry?
Fuzz might be able to find a slide of it.
Yes. You have to remind me what it was, because so we had the micro.
That there's
we've been using it in a piece of research at the moment, so we are so familiar with it.
Oh, that's why. Absolutely. I think when we're looking at dynamics, we have to look at the micro. We have to look at the point that, for example, children, even the Convention on the Rights of the Child says that children must be seen in units of families. You can't look at children on their own. That's why a lot of ministries, government ministries around the world, you don't just have, Ministry of Children, you have Ministry of, Children's and Families departments and things like this. So when we look at family dynamics, we can always look at, what's happening in the family, what kind of patterns are occurring when we're looking at data, when we're looking at, whole communities or countries. And then we also need to look at institutions, organizations, and what's happening, and how do, for example, organizations work with each other. How do we have a system of child protection that works with government, that works with private sector, that works with communities, and works with other institutions? So, I mean, that's where we were looking at how we would do analysis, but it's also where we need to look at strengthening systems, which is why, for example, I always say that if we're going to go and work in communities to respond to child labor, we need to work alongside communities. We need to work alongside the trajectory of development that countries are already traveling along. And I know that there's a lot of talk about corporate responsibility for human rights violations in supply chains. And of course, corporations are responsible for their supply chains, which is their own system, but the supply chains exist in the context, which is the macro, in the context of countries, in the context of, cultures, and in the context of histories. And you can't see a supply chain without, and try to solve complex, wicked issues like child labor without looking at the history of a country, without looking at the culture, without looking at the socio-political angle. And also supporting a sustainable response means you've got to see, okay, where is this community going? Where has this community come from over the last 50 years, the last 10 years? And where is this community going to go in the next 10 years and in the next 20 years? And we're also already seeing, for example, in West Africa, development of systems of education, development of systems of governance. So what do we want to support in strengthening those existing mechanisms? What we don't want to do is build parallel mechanisms. And often I think we need to look at ourselves. I've worked with NGOs before as well. And, we can often have funding for a 5-year program, a 2-year program, a 1-year program, and think we can solve a problem like child labor in 1 year. But we can't. What we can do is contribute to it. And what we should be contributing to is the existing systems and the trajectory of development that a country or a community is traveling along. And we have to be aware of the micro, the systemic, the kind of institutions that are around, and then of course the national level system and the international level system as well. So these are just a quick kind of soundbite around those 3 areas. I don't know, hopefully that makes sense to people, but I
think can I just jump into that one? And the other one, particularly in the micro, is the imaginations that we are casting sometimes, and even trying to be careful. We need to be careful on the images that we're projecting with this, because I keep going back time and time again, Artie, when we were at the World Cocoa Conference and you were doing that session, and you were saying, this is not about people in West Africa where there's so much child labor. It's not about parents being bad parents. And I remember all the African women almost shaking their heads off going, Yes, yes. So I think that, again, we need to understand where it's coming from, where we deal with it, and not put on, oh, well, it's just bad parents to allow them to get out and do child labor.
You know, so I mean, yeah, we just exactly. And I mean, Elizabeth Sorrell's just made a point about the practicalities of accessing school. Of course, like if we had proper roads and if we had transport, you know, for communities, if communities had access to transport and movement, why wouldn't and there was an access to school, you know, why wouldn't the children go to school, right? I mean, it's just about giving access. Sorry, Carolyn, you were going to say.
And electricity is another thing that I'd add to that, Artie.
Yes.
When you've got electricity in a household, the difference that makes is astronomical.
Yeah. I was just going to say, one of the imaginations that we sometimes use is that we need to run an ambulance service at the bottom of the cliff. So if we find children in hazardous child labour, we need to respond. We need to find a way of helping them out of that context and with the restoration and healing that they need. We also need to be building a fence at the top of the cliff to stop other children from falling over into child labour, and that's things like good schools and so on and so forth. But we also, one of the things that I say is, yep, it's better to build a fence at the top of the cliff than run an ambulance service at the bottom. But what's even better is let's build a new road that actually doesn't go anywhere near the cliff. Let's be brave enough to have an imagination about a world where we're actually prepared to change our structures and systems significantly enough that this does not happen anymore.
Can you give a practical example of that?
Of changing structures and systems?
No, of the road going nowhere near the edge of it, the cliff. Because I think that's such a really rich image.
Yeah, I remember, and apologies, I know some people on this call have already heard this, but I remember when I was in India working a number of years ago, and I went to this small village that was in the far north of India. It was actually, you could actually pick up Bhutan mobile networks easier than you could pick up Indian ones. And this village, it was probably about 250, 200 families, and their children kept on disappearing. And it was migration or labour hire agents that would come into the village that would say, oh, don't worry about going to school. I can get you a job in Delhi, in Mumbai, in whatever. You'll earn this much money. And of course, it was always lies. The children might stay in touch for a little while, but then they
disappeared.
They disappeared. And people just didn't know where they were. And I think one of the most tragic days of my life was sitting in a community hall, and it was all very formal with people sitting in rows, and I was out the front and with a plastic tablecloth and a glass of water. And at the end, you know, they wanted to know why I was there, which was fair enough. I'd invaded their village. And at the end of it, I said, are there any questions? And one by one, these people stood up, and they had these little tattered, mostly sort of passport size photos. And they said, you know, can you help me find my daughter? Can you help me find my my sister, my cousin, my uncle. And these were the children that had disappeared from this village into labour situations. And I never forget the transformation. We actually went back to that same place and were in the same hall 4 years later. So, you know, I just simply said to them, no, these people are not migrant agents or labour agents. They're trafficking your children into slavery. And you know, this whole idea then took root. And when we went back there 3 years later, same room, except all of the benches were around the outside in a circle, and and as we walked in, instead of kind of formally walking down the aisle, two young people grabbed the arms of each of us and sat down with us. And then they presented what they'd been doing to end child labour in their village. And they'd
acted out.
They'd been doing street dramas all around the villages in the area to raise awareness about
how it happens,
how it happens, about how you can prevent it, what you should do if it happens, and they proudly told us that there had only been 2 children that had left the village, and in the last 2 years they knew where both of them were because they'd accompanied them, they'd registered them with the police in the places they were going, etc., etc. So that actually made the system work in a way that actually diverted it away from these children falling into child labour.
And they had worked out who the most vulnerable children were, and so they concentrated on those in having a safety net in the community. And one of the groups in a village next door said, oh yes, we've calculated and we are positive we saved 38 children this last year from being caught and tracked away into child labour.
So that's just one little example. And it doesn't actually need a massive amount of international development money. It just needs me to come and say, hey, maybe you could look at this in a slightly different way.
And a local NGO to help them to process what you have said through into a strategy.
That's brilliant. Yes. And it like you said, it doesn't take much. I mean, I remember being in some communities in West Africa talking to farmers, and in the communities that I found where there wasn't electricity, I found, and this is why I came up with the theory around having access to electricity and the impact it has on child labor, because where there were remote communities that didn't have electricity, weren't able to move out of their villages and get around even to the local market. It was amazing how remote some of these places are. Living in Asia for like 17 years, there's motorbikes everywhere. And if there's not motorbikes, there would be bicycles. But yet we'd be in these villages in West Africa and some of these villages in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, and there were no transportation. And so just imagine being in this community with no electricity. Everything is manual. Literally everything you do is manual, and you have to do it during daylight hours. And so there was this kind of question about, why would we educate our children? Like, they're just going to work on the farms anyway, aren't they? And then going to communities that had 6 months, 1 year of electricity, which meant they also had access to TV, radio, and things like this. And all of a sudden, their world has opened up. And this world that's opened up means more information, like you, Carolyn, coming in and like giving information, and the NGOs coming in and maybe giving information. But it's almost like poverty isn't just about money. Poverty is about information. Poverty is about education. Poverty is about having access to understanding and having access to being heard as well, but also having access to more choices. And I think this is really important to understand about poverty. Poverty isn't just about money, and it's about all of the things that infrastructure builds. And it's about having access to networks. It's about having access to resources, and not just financial resources, but all kinds of information. So, and coming out of isolation. I think that's really important to consider. So sometimes the inputs are quite basic. And don't have to be elaborate, but they can have and the other part of this is that, when we're looking at child labor, we're often looking at it as one issue. And when we're looking at a community, children could be, dying of malaria, but we're only interested in children being in child labor, and sometimes only in one commodity. But maybe we need to sort out what's actually more important and more of a priority first. So this is another thing that I wanted to talk about.
And I think in like manner, Artie, we were working with a community in Burundi in Africa, and they were indigenous people. They got dislocated because of the fighting that happened, and they got some land. It was arid land, but there's no water there, and they used to have to walk 20 kilometers each way each day to get water. So the children would have to take a child-sized bucket with the mother, and each day they'd have to go and do that. So Carolyn had been visited there, found out about this, taken a group there. They said, well, what would it take to get water here? Oh, many schemes have happened. Is there no water underneath? Oh yeah, there is water, but it's down a fair way. So money was raised very quickly by this group when they went back home, and two bores were put down. Well, that changed the whole village.
That must have changed everything.
Children could then have time to go to school. And so I went back there about another 4 or 5 years later, and there were schools, there was a clinic, a medical clinic, and there were trade schools to help them to develop the skills. And then they could, as a village, take on these trades and
income generation.
Yeah, it was income generation they could do, because they had the time to do that, because the children did not have to go and collect water with their parents.
Yes, what you're describing it is supporting people to come out of survival mode.
Yeah,
because when you're in survival mode, you need the labor of your children. You need the labor of your children, and this is why one of the other major interventions at national level that has been shown to have an impact on reducing child labor are, conditional cash transfers, social programs for the most vulnerable. And I saw some very good examples of that in Indonesia, for example, where there's a very decentralized government, and power and authority is devolved out to local governments, villages, and social benefits can be actually claimed by families, young mothers, supporting vulnerable families to keep their kids in school. Conditional cash transfers is also very important, a national policy that can be used to make sure that those that are most at risk are caught, and they won't need the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. They won't go anywhere near it. So that's another road, an example of a road that goes out from the edge of the cliff. That was a nice analogy, Carolyn.
I think one of the things that we also realized as a team, as we were preparing these and talking about them, is that at the one level, you've got your very valuable and useful ILO, UNICEF, etc. reports that define what child labour is, that so on and so forth. And then you've got the reality of the context. And, just as an example, for example, hazardous child labour is defined as, using sharp instruments like machetes. Well, and I know there's some people on this call who've spent time in Papua New Guinea, and, most kids carry a machete in Papua New Guinea. And I can remember Friday afternoons were the afternoons where the school oval got mowed. And it wasn't with a tractor, it was with a line of kids slashing machetes, and nobody cut anything off. These kids were so skilled with these machetes, and that's how the airfield got mowed, so the planes could come in. That's how the school oval got mowed. That's how the roads were kept open with these. Some of them, the machete looked bigger than the child. So you've got these definitions at one level, which are helpful, but then you've got the reality of the context. How is it, and sometimes that's a total disconnect between what's actually going on locally and what is practice and what these definitions are. Do you want to reflect a little bit on that, Artie?
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. I think that sometimes I wonder about these kinds of idealistic conceptual frameworks that are often put together at very high level, strategic high level, in Geneva or some other place, in the sorry to say, but in the West or in the global North, has already been, you know, mentioned here, but they don't really fit in the contextual experience of, let's say, if we're talking about Asia and Africa, where I have, you know, the most experience, they don't fit. And that's a brilliant example, Carolyn. Often, you know, laws are passed in a lot of these countries because they're trying to appease, you know, and align with international, you know, standards, these international ILO or whatever UNICEF, you know, standards, which are important, and we do need to get there at some point. And at the same time, we also need to be realistic about what is actually happening on the ground and how things work on the ground. You know, child labor sounds like, you know, we can get very emotive about child labor, can't we? But there's so many different types of child labor. You've got the worst forms, which is like forced labor and trafficking. And then you've got cases where really just a child's missed, you know, I don't mean to dismiss it, but it could be a case of a child has, you know, missed half a day of school because he's had to work on the farm. I mean, I've missed school because I had to work at home when I was a child. Maybe that was child labor because I had to miss school. But it's hardly the same as, you know, being trafficked or something like that. And I think that's really important to remember, you know, the difference between concepts that we have in our minds and the reality on the ground. I mean, I think those kids you're talking about, Caroline, you know, could probably, like, you know, use those machetes better than I could even hold one, you know?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. It's quite extraordinary to watch them do it. Like, you're just kind of going, I'm so uncoordinated compared to that. Okay. Maybe just a bit of a reflection on, I think one of the things that we also noticed was that there's a big difference between what's happening in rural contexts and urban contexts. Does somebody want to pick up just a little bit around that?
Do you want to?
Sure.
Do you want to sit? Yeah.
It's been interesting. We've been working on some of the research in Phnom Penh, and there's a very strong street kid, as we use the term, in Phnom Penh. And so one of the NGOs that we do a lot of work with was doing a longitudinal study and trying to develop a relationship with them. And they said, oh, well, we can get you back into school. And they said, we don't want to go to school. What we want to learn, though, is actually how to count and how to do money, because we're doing these deals on the street, and we don't think that we are being treated fairly, and we're being diddled out of money. We need to know how to count and how to do that. So they were talking more about numeracy than they were about literacy. And they said, no, we don't want to go to school. We want some life skills to be able to survive there. Now, that's very, very different to some of the children that I've seen in cocoa farms in West Africa. Is very different to some of the ones that I have seen in Uganda, particularly the North Uganda, and what I've seen in parts of Asia, and where in the rice fields, the children have got to go out because the only way that they can survive is actually to get the crops going, which of course are being affected immensely by climate change at the moment. And so it's more than just all hands on deck. Is actually about, for us to survive as a family, we work together so much as a family unit when we are in an agroeconomy where we've got to work together and to work together with others. There was one person that I talked to who the family in Myanmar were really being affected by this, and they said the only way that we're going to get to survive while we work out how to farm in this new environment is for one of us to go across to Thailand to get a job to send money back, so we've got enough rice to eat while we work out how to redo this. They got diddled and got to Thailand, and they had raised all the money they could and said, okay, we'll give you a loan, we can pay it off when you get the job. And the person in Thailand said, the labor agent said, well, you owe me $5,000. I said, no, and described the situation in mine. I said, no, that was to him, you owe me this. He said, well, I haven't got that money. He said, well, you've got to go into whatever job that we give you. And so he was placed in a fishing boat. And then, as he told me, I never walked on land for 17 years. And it's a story that we often tell. And it was because of the displacement. And so the rural situations are different to a lot of the urban situations, where there are a lot of other children around, where they work together much more, where there is often, not always, more chance of having schools there, whereas a lot of isolated rural areas, they aren't even schools for them to be able to learn and to get. So I think it is different. That's just a couple of quick examples of the difference between urban and rural child labour.
And also the difference between like migration, because you've talked about migration and migration across borders, migration from rural areas to urban areas, and they all do need different kinds of responses. So yeah, sorry, Carolyn, I interrupted you.
Yeah. Oh no, that's fine. I'm just aware that we are
time. Yes.
Yeah, heading towards time. So, Fuzz, do you want to introduce your model of where we're heading?
One of the things that has come about again and again, is that up? Just going to check. Is that so often in this reality of child labour, we find that we're way behind, communities way behind, nations are way behind, and we know what the best is, or there's got a concept that everybody wants to go straight from being behind to best. But the reality is in this that it's that better is the road to best. And so it's a step better, it's a step better, it's a step better, which will actually get it closer to best, rather than trying to jump from being we're way behind into, oh, this is the best, we've got to have this now. It's a strategy in the road which is the better road, which goes from behind to better to best.
Great. Excellent.
Absolutely.
Well,
I just
go Artie.
Just really quickly, I know we're on time, but what I wanted to say, the reason I really like that model is because we are getting under pressure with these 5-year plans to eliminate child labor. We've got to eradicate child labor in the next 10 years. I mean, I think that we've got to take a much more realistic approach. And by rushing things and trying to get from behind to best within 5 years, we're kind of going to just end up doing a lot of investing a lot of time, money, and resources in things that aren't going to work in the long term. We need to take a longer term sustainable approach. But thank you for that model, Fuzz. Thank you, Carolyn.
One of the things that we're really quite grateful for and Fuzz is going to bring the screen up on this. Is that right, Fuzz?
Yep.
Is the participation of NGOs who we think are doing exemplary work in this area. And one of the things that we thought is that we would like to give back to them, to make a donation to the 4 not-for-profits that are working in India, Turkey and Cambodia, who've been part of this series, who are supporting children. If you'd like to make a donation that we will pass on to those organisations, then please go to our website, beslaveryfree.com/child-labour, and make a donation there, and let's see if as a community we can support them. And so thank you for being part of this series. We will send you a copy of this. It will be up online, and you are very welcome to use it in any way that works for you. So Artie, been a delight to work with you. Fuzz, as always, a delight to work with you. Anna, thank you for all of the setup. And yeah, we'll have a chat about what we're going to do next year.
A lot of work to do.
So yes, Artie, thank you.
Thank you,
Carolyn, and we look forward to making a difference together in all these areas of modern slavery.